Okay, we are going to go over the poems Overheard in an Orchard and The Day is Done. And again, just a reminder, I want you to have read these poems and used the poetry analysis methods before you watch this video. Because as I've mentioned many times, there are not necessarily 100% right answers and 100% wrong answers. It really is a lot of times, yes, there are, maybe better answers or better understandings, but there's, especially for some of them, there's not a right or wrong answer. There can be multiple answers. So I want you to have already looked at these poems and thought about them and written down your thoughts about the poems before you come here, because I definitely don't think that my analysis of these poems are the end-all be-all analysis. I will want to hear what you guys had to say about these poems, read what you guys had to say, but I do want you to take notes on what I have for you here. So I will be looking for your answers and my answers on your homework sheet. Okay, so without further ado, here we have Overheard in an Orchard. The poem goes, "Said the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, friend, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me." Okay, for this poem you were to use the Stamp FL method. And so the first part of that is subject, and we know that the subject may not be explicitly stated in the poem or in the title, and the way I saw the subject was about worry, human beings and how they worry about things that they can't control. So your subject is always maybe just a word or phrase. Your theme is where you actually make that statement of value. What is the poem saying about the subject? The message, lesson that it's trying to convey. And essentially what I got out of it is that worry means you're not trusting God. You have this robin and you have this sparrow talking about human beings worrying, and they don't understand it. They think, well, they must not have a God, or else they wouldn't worry. The robin and the sparrow know that they can trust a God, so they think that worrying means that they don't have a God to trust. So that's what I wrote down as my thesis statement or theme statement. The tone of the poem, that is the author's attitude. And this poem has a distinctive meter and rhyme scheme. You don't have to go through and analyze that and write it out, but just when you read it out loud you can tell. The meter doesn't change, the rhyme scheme doesn't change, and so that just feels very carefree to me. And it's kind of ironic when the subject is worrying, but the robin and the sparrow are very carefree, and if you're trusting in God, then you can be carefree as well. So that's one tone word. Usually it's best to come up with multiple tone words. I'll be interested to see what you guys have as your tone words. I mentioned this in class the other day, possibly bringing in a printout that has a lot of tone words to choose from. What I was talking about when I mentioned something that I found was this blog post right here. You can see the web address up here if you would like to go to it yourself. 155 words to describe an author's tone. And you scroll down a little bit and you have innumerable words. You have a whole bunch of words, and it'll even give you a word and then other words like it. So there's a lot of words to choose from here. So a resource like this could be helpful in coming up with tone words. The method, the type of poem, again, I just said lyric. I didn't go into more specifics than that. This is very sing-song like. And then the purpose, and again, this is another category that I said it's usually best to come up with more than one, but really for me the main thing here was to encourage. It's not an explicit encouragement, but at the same time, you have this robin and the sparrow who are not worried because they have a heavenly Father, and that should be an encouragement to us, and I feel like that's probably the purpose of the poem. And I just noticed that I skipped the audience, but that's attached to the purpose. If the purpose is to encourage, who would be encouraged by this poem? And it would be believers. An unbeliever would not be trusting in the Heavenly Father anyway. So this would be encouraging to believers who do have a Father, who do have God to trust in. And I also said that it could be for those who are anxious, because those are the ones who would need that encouragement. And then figurative language, biggest thing that stood out to me was personification. You have the robin and you have the sparrow talking as if they are humans. They're not meant to represent humans, obviously. They're meant to represent a robin and a sparrow. But they're talking, and that's not something they can do. So that would be personification. And then also there's some imagery. Just the fact that you do have the robin and the sparrow talking, you can visualize that in your mind. And then that fourth line, rush about and worry so, creates an image of human behavior. Okay, so that's your first poem. Pretty short, quick, and easy. Now, the next poem The Day is Done by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This was a much longer poem, so it might have been a little bit more difficult. And especially since we have only done TP Cast once together. But hopefully you tried and got something out of it. I did want to note, just kind of FYI, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is a well-known, well-renowned poet. Some of the poets that we've read so far are not poets that I'm familiar with, and a lot of the poetry has been Before we get started, I did want to just let you guys know that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is a well-known, well-renowned American poet. You can see here that he wrote in the 19th century, and that's, the 1800s. So he's pretty well known. A lot of the poets that we've read so far, a lot of the poetry in our book has been Christian poetry, and that's kind of been the focus. And those are poets that I'm unfamiliar with. But Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, you probably noticed as you read this poem that it's not explicitly Christian. There's not a theme related to Christianity here, and that's why, because he's not a Christian poet. He's a poet from American literature. So just wanted to kind of point that out to you, that some of the poets were not major players in the literature world, but this poet is. So you have The Day is Done, and the first thing that you were supposed to do is think about what the title could mean before reading it. So just look at the title. What pops out at you? What jumps out? What could that title refer to? And of course, the title is The Day is Done. So to me, I thought about, well, it's evening time, so maybe the poem could be about the sun going down, getting ready for bed, those sorts of things. So after you think about the title, you move on to the poem, and the P and TP cast is to paraphrase. So what I personally did is I read through the whole poem once, and then I started reading through it again, one stanza at a time, to do my paraphrase. Okay, so I'm going to trust that you have already read through the poem once from beginning to end, no stops, no thinking about it, just reading it, and then also that you read through it for your paraphrases. But that's what I'm going to go through now. So the first stanza says, "The day is done, and the darkness falls from the wings of night, as a feather is wafted downward from an eagle in his flight." Okay. There is some imagery there. You'll notice that I circled a simile, darkness compared to a feather falling from an eagle in his flight. But really the most simple paraphrase of that stanza is it's a description of day ending. The day is done and the darkness comes. Okay. Second stanza, "I see the lights of the village gleam through the rain and the mist, and a feeling of sadness comes o'er me that my soul cannot resist." So we have the speaker saying "I," referring to himself or herself. The speaker can see the village, and the speaker is sad. That's the basic paraphrase there. Third stanza, "A feeling of sadness and longing that is not akin to pain, and resembles sorrow only as the mist resembles the rain." Okay. Again, we have another simile. You hopefully notice that there are several similes in this poem. This one is comparing sorrow to a mist that resembles rain. So the basic paraphrase here is that the speaker feels not really any pain, just a sadness. Okay, fourth stanza. The speaker calls out to some unnamed person here. He says, "Come, read to me some poem, some simple heartfelt lay, that shall soothe this restless feeling and banish the thoughts of day." Okay, so the speaker's calling out to some unnamed person to come read him a poem in order to forget the day. Fifth stanza. "Not from the great old masters, not from the bards sublime, whose distant footsteps echo through the corridors of time." So essentially he's saying don't read one of the well-known poets. Don't read someone who is critically acclaimed, who has been well-known and discussed throughout time. 4, okay, going into the 6th stanza. I think I kind of lost count, 6th stanza. 4 connects it to that stanza, so keeping that in mind, don't read a poem from the greats. For or because, like strains of martial music, their mighty thoughts suggest life's endless toil and endeavor, and tonight I long for rest. So what he's saying here is that those poems from the great, they talk about life's troubles. That's not what the speaker wants to think about. He longs for rest. So whatever stanza we're on now, lost count again, line 25. "Read from some humbler poet whose songs gushed from his heart, as showers from the clouds of summer or tears from the eyelids start." Okay, so here he's saying don't read from, going back to that idea, don't read from the greats, read from someone lesser known, because those poems come straight from the heart, they're genuine. And then there's another simile here. Poems gush from the heart are as showers from the clouds of summer or tears from the eyelids. Okay. Next stanza. "Who through long days of labor and nights devoid of ease still heard in his soul the music of wonderful melodies." So again, even though we're going by this through this stanza by stanza, you have to keep in mind the stanzas before it. Who and his are still referring to that humbler poet. Okay, the speaker is not referring to the person who's going to read him a poem or the great poets. He's still referring to this humbler poet that he's talking about right here. A humbler poet who, through long days of labor and nights devoid of ease, still heard in his soul the music of wonderful melodies. So this poet, these humbler poets in general do have difficulties, just like he does. But despite those tough times, still had a happy song in their heart, and the music of his soul, which led to the outpour of this poetry, was still positive. Okay, next stanza. Such songs have power to quiet the restless pulse of care, and come like the benediction that follows after prayer. Okay, so here's a simile comparing these songs, these pure songs from the heart, comparing them to the healing of prayer. Okay, so poems like prayer. Next stanza. Then read from the treasured volume the poem of thy choice. Okay, so he's addressing his friend, whoever that may be, again now. Read from the treasured volume the poem of thy choice, and lend to the rhyme of the poet the beauty of thy voice. So the speaker is calling on this unnamed person to read aloud the poem of their choice. Last stanza. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like Arabs, and as silently steal away. And I just noticed that I forgot to circle like there and acknowledge this other simile. But what we have here is that this poem, the words written by the humbler poet, spoken by this friend of his, shall be like music. And this poem will give peace, chase away the cares of the day. Okay, so that is your paraphrase of the poem stanza by stanza. The next part of TPcast is connotation versus denotation. And I just jotted down some words here that stood out to me, and I didn't go through and look up the definition or look up or write the connotation in the poem, but just kind of jotted down some words to talk about. I noticed sadness mentioned a lot. There's kind of this overlay of sadness from the speaker. He talks about being restless, but then he also talks about the wanting rest. So kind of that comparison between restlessness and rest. But another thing that really stood out to me was the words poem and poet. And, this is something maybe that's not specific, maybe not what the author intended, but something that for us to think about as modern day readers. A lot of people don't like poetry. They find it difficult, or they just don't like it. But here you have this speaker who finds peace and joy and comfort in poems. So that's kind of the interesting to me, connotation versus denotation, or really connotation versus connotation. The connotation that we may have for poem or poet is, oh, that's hard, oh, that I don't like that, it doesn't make any sense, it's too difficult to think about, versus the connotation within this poem. You have the speaker who wants to hear poetry, who adores the poetry. It gives him the peace that he needs at the end of the day. Which honestly, it kind of occurred to me as I've been going through this poem this second or third time at this point, that what I just mentioned, that this poet is a well-known poet. I don't know whether he was when he wrote this poem. But the poems that we've read earlier, that are a bit easier and by lesser known or humbler poets, I mean, can you relate to this guy with what he's saying here? Those quote-unquote easier poems, perhaps, by humbler poets that are talking about the Lord and what He does for us, those sorts of things, did those give you peace? Were those easier to understand? And I mean, you go back to the stanza, such songs have power to quiet the restless pulse of care and come like the benediction that follows after prayer. Did you find those poems to be like that? I'll be honest, it would be great if I was that awesome and thought of this ahead of time, but I did not do this on purpose. It's just kind of interesting to me now that those poems that we read first are almost like the poems that he's asking, that the speaker of this poem is asking someone to read to him. So connotation really is completely up to you, what words stuck out, what the connotation of those words are, what the dictionary meaning of those words are. Audience, again here I think that the audience could be those who are anxious. We have this speaker in the poem who doesn't seem like he's going to be able to sleep very well. He's kind of sad, he's restless. I think all of those could be described as anxious. And by asking this other person to read a poem to him, it could be advice to someone who is anxious. Then you have the shift, and the shift is a change in speaker, place, or tone. And the hint on your handout says to look for transitional words, but there's not always a explicit transitional word. In class, the poem that we did had transitional words like but, B-U-T. But I noticed that in this poem there were some shifts or transitions that did not include transitional words. So really, and I kind of tried to get this across in class, you really have to look for that shift in or change in what's being discussed. The transitional words can sometimes help you, but not every transitional word indicates a shift, and not every shift has a transitional word. Okay, I noticed 3 transitions in this poem. One at line 13 at the word come. Okay, because notice that before that line, that word, he's talking about the day is done and he feels sad, essentially. That's all he's been discussing. And then at come, it changes to calling out to this friend to come spend time with him, read him a poem. So that's a shift in what's being discussed. Okay, the next shift I noticed was at line 25. Okay, so he says, come read me some poem, and then he talks about, but what not to read. Come read a poem, but not this. So at line 25, he tells his friend what he does want him to read. So that's a change in topic of discussion. And then the last shift I noticed was at line 37. And there is a transitional word here, then. Then read from the treasured volume. Excuse me. Then read from the treasured volume. Okay, so he had from line 25 to here been talking about what he did want to hear, and the goodness of humbler poets and what they write. He's been explaining that, and then here he said he kind of comes back to speaking directly to the speaker and saying, so go ahead and do this. Go ahead and take this treasured volume of poetry, choose the poem of your voice, and read it. Okay. Then the next T is going back to the title. And now that you have kind of evaluated other parts of the poem, what do you think the title could mean? And there is an extent to which the title is literal, the day is done, and at the beginning of the poem he really is saying that the day is over, it's evening, it's becoming night, and then he goes and describes how that makes him sad. But obviously there's probably something besides just the day being done that's making him sad. Now, he doesn't explain that, but the thought that kind of jumped out at me was that day, sometimes figuratively, well, day literally is light, but light is sometimes figurative for, goodness is light, darkness is something bad or evil. So this poet is going through a hard time. We don't know why, but he's experiencing some darkness and some sadness. So the title could be figurative as well. The day is done. He's not experiencing light or goodness. He's not going through an easy time in life. Maybe it's difficult. He's experiencing some darkness. And then the theme, after going through all of these different things, essentially what the poem is someone going through a difficult time asking a friend to help them find peace. So I think that what that could indicate to us is that others can help us through difficult times, not to try to go through those difficult times alone. Ask for help when you need it. And then this is the theme that, again, you don't always have to agree with the theme. Maybe you don't agree with this, but this person is looking to an art form for some comfort. So does art, the beauty in the world, help us get through difficult times? For him, it's poetry. It could be music. It could be a book. It could be a painting. But could a theme here be that art, something beautiful that has been created, can that also help us through difficult times? So, plenty of ideas to think about. I look forward to hearing what you guys got out of these poems. Be sure that you have your own notes that you did before this, hopefully, and then you took notes on this lecture as well, and have that in class to turn in.